Blood from the wounded Apache boy seeped through Sarah's trembling fingers as she fought to save a child others would have left to die. At dawn, the thunder of 100 warriors' hooves shook her homestead, and she faced the most feared chief in Arizona territory, the boy's father, whose single gesture would determine whether she lived or died. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The Arizona territory stretched out before her like a cruel painting, all harsh lines and unforgiving colors. Sarah Wilkins stood on the weathered porch of her modest homestead, one hand shielding her eyes from the setting sun, the other clutching the worn wooden post that threatened to give way beneath her touch. The wind carried the scent of rain, a rare promise in this parched land that had taken so much from her already. At 34, Sarah's face had begun to show the lines of a life lived under the relentless desert sun. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone 3 years now, taken by a fever that swept through these parts with the indifference of a dust storm. Their dreams of a prosperous ranch had withered alongside him, leaving her with 20 acres of stubborn land, a handful of chickens, 2 horses, and memories that whispered to her in the darkest hours of the night. Just a bit more time, she murmured to herself, scanning the horizon where dark clouds gathered. The smell of rain was unmistakable now, and she needed to collect more firewood before the downpour began. With practiced movements, Sarah tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair back into her simple bun, adjusted her faded cotton dress, and stepped off the porch. The approaching storm cast long shadows across the scrubland as Sarah made her way toward the small copse of juniper trees at the edge of her property. Her boots crunched against the dry earth, a sound so familiar it had become part of her heartbeat. The basket she carried swung gently against her leg, its weight a comfort, a reminder of routine, of normalcy in a land where such things were precious. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a warning she heeded by quickening her pace. The junipers came into view, their twisted forms dark against the purpling sky. Sarah bent to collect fallen branches, her movements efficient and practiced. This had been Thomas's job once. Now it was hers, like everything else. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape for a brief, brilliant moment, and that's when she saw it. A dark shape huddled at the base of the largest juniper, unnaturally still. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she kept in the pocket of her apron. "Hello!" she called, her voice nearly lost in the rising wind. "Is someone there?" No response came, but as another bolt of lightning split the sky, Sarah caught a glimpse of what looked like a child's form. Her heart lurched in her chest. Without thinking, she dropped her basket and rushed forward, caution forgotten. The boy couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He lay curled on his side, dark hair matted with blood, skin the color of the earth itself. His breathing came in shallow, pained gasps. And there, staining his buckskin clothing, was the unmistakable bloom of blood, fresh and frighteningly abundant. "Oh, dear God," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside him. The boy's eyes flew open at her touch, dark, fathomless eyes filled with a mixture of pain and terror. He tried to scramble away, a strangled cry escaping his lips, but the movement clearly caused him agony. He collapsed back against the tree, one hand clutching his side. Sarah recognized what he was immediately: Apache. The realization should have sent her running back to the safety of her cabin. Just last month, the Hendersons' place 10 miles east had been raided. Nothing left but ashes and bodies, or so the stories went. Every settler in the territory lived with the shadow of such tales hanging over them. But Sarah had been a nurse during the war between the states. She had seen too much death to turn away from a child in need, any child, regardless of the color of his skin or the people he belonged to. "I won't hurt you," she said softly, knowing he probably couldn't understand her words but hoping her tone might reach him. "Let me help you." Fat droplets of rain began to fall, pattering against the leaves above them. The boy's eyes never left her face, wary and wild like those of a wounded animal. When Sarah reached toward him again, he flinched but didn't pull away. With gentle fingers, she examined the wound in his side. A gunshot, without question. The bullet had passed clean through, which was fortunate, but he had lost a lot of blood. Without proper care, he wouldn't survive the night. "I need to get you somewhere dry," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "My home." Not far. Thunder crashed overhead and the rain began to fall in earnest. Decision made. Sarah slipped her arms beneath the boy's slight frame. He was lighter than she expected, all sinew and bone. When she lifted him, he cried out, a sound that pierced her heart, but he didn't struggle. The journey back to the cabin seemed endless. Rain lashed at them, turning the ground to mud that sucked at Sarah's boots with each labored step. The boy's blood soaked through her dress, warm against the chill of the storm. By the time she staggered onto her porch, they were both drenched, and Sarah's arms trembled with exertion. Inside, she laid him carefully on the small cot near the fireplace, the same place where Thomas had spent his final days. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she should use this spot to try to save the life of a child whose people were feared and hated by her own. As Sarah moved around the cabin, gathering clean cloths, her medical kit and water heating on the stove, she knew what she was doing could be considered treason by some. Harboring an Apache, especially a male who would one day become a warrior. If he survived the night, the thought made her pause, hands stilling over the kettle. Then she straightened her shoulders and continued her preparations. Some choices transcended the boundaries drawn by men and their conflicts. This was one of them. Outside, the storm raged, rattling the windows of the small cabin. Inside, Sarah Wilkins prepared to wage her own battle against death, unaware that her act of mercy had set in motion events that would forever alter the course of her life. Sarah worked with the precision born of grim experience. The war between the states had taught her hands not to tremble, her stomach not to turn, and her mind to focus only on the task before her. Clean the wound, stop the bleeding, fight the fever that would surely come. The boy watched her through half-lidded eyes, his breathing shallow and rapid. When she cut away his bloodied buckskin shirt with kitchen shears, he made no move to stop her, only winced as the fabric pulled away from the wound. This will hurt," she warned, knowing he couldn't understand her words, but hoping he might comprehend her tone. She showed him the bottle of whiskey, Thomas's last bottle, kept for medicinal purposes, before pouring a measure over the ragged hole in his side. The boy's entire body went rigid. A strangled cry escaped his throat, quickly bitten back as if he feared the sound might betray weakness. His small hand shot out, fingers digging into Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. Their eyes met, hers apologetic, his filled with pain and something deeper, more complex. Pride, perhaps, or defiance. "Brave," Sarah murmured, the word an acknowledgement rather than a platitude. She worked methodically, cleaning the entry and exit wounds, applying a poultice of yarrow and comfrey that she'd learned to make from an old Navajo woman who'd once passed through. The boy's skin burned beneath her touch, the fever taking hold faster than she'd hoped. "You have a name?" she asked as she wrapped clean strips of linen around his torso. "I'm Sarah." She pressed a hand to her chest. "Sarah," she repeated. The boy's eyes, glazed with fever, fixed on her face. For a moment, Sarah thought he might speak. Instead, his lids fluttered closed, his head lolling to the side as unconsciousness claimed him. Outside, the storm raged on. Rain hammered against the cabin's roof, and wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls. Sarah added logs to the fire, its warmth a bulwark against the chill that had settled into her bones. She changed her bloodied dress for a clean one, hung the wet clothes by the fire, and settled into the rocking chair beside the cot. The clock on the mantel ticked away the hours. Midnight came and went. The boy's fever climbed higher. Sarah bathed his brow with cool water, spooned tiny amounts of broth between his cracked lips when he seemed conscious enough to swallow, and changed the dressings on his wound when blood seeped through. In his delirium, the boy spoke. Strange, guttural words that Sarah couldn't understand. Sometimes he cried out, his body jerking as if trying to escape unseen enemies. Other times, he whispered what sounded like names, his tone achingly tender. During one such moment, Sarah found herself wondering about his family. Did they know he was missing? Were they searching for him even now, in the midst of the storm? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced toward the Winchester rifle that hung above the door, Thomas's rifle, which she'd learned to use out of necessity rather than desire. What would happen if the boy's people found him here? Would they see her care for him, or would they see only a white woman, an enemy? Dawn approached, the storm finally exhausting itself. Sarah, fighting to keep her eyes open, was startled when the boy suddenly spoke clearly. "Nakohi," he said, his voice weak but deliberate. Sarah leaned closer. "What did you say?" The boy pressed a hand to his chest, mimicking her earlier gesture. "Nakohi." A smile touched Sarah's lips. "Nakohi," she repeated, tasting the foreign name. "I'm Sarah." "Sarah," he echoed, the syllables awkward on his tongue. It was a small victory, this exchange of names, a bridge across a vast divide. Sarah's heart lightened, even as exhaustion pulled at her limbs. "You're going to be all right, Nakohe," she said, more to herself than to him. "I'll see to that." The boy's eyes drifted closed again, but his breathing seemed easier now, less labored. The worst of the fever had broken. Sarah allowed herself to lean back in the rocking chair just for a moment, just to rest her eyes. She woke with a start to sunlight streaming through the windows. The raging storm had given way to the crystalline clarity that sometimes followed desert rainfall. Birds sang outside, an incongruously cheerful sound after such a night. Nakohe was awake, watching her with those fathomless dark eyes. Some of the wariness had left them, replaced by something like curiosity. He looked younger in the daylight, more vulnerable, though the set of his jaw spoke of a strength beyond his years. "Good morning," Sarah said softly. She stood, wincing as her stiff muscles protested, and moved to check his wound. The angry red of infection had not appeared, thank God. The poultice seemed to be working. "Hungry?" she asked, miming the act of eating. Nakohe nodded, a small movement but unmistakable. Sarah busied herself at the stove, aware of his gaze following her every move. She prepared a simple broth, adding bits of dried venison for strength. When she returned to his side with the steaming bowl, she found him attempting to sit up. "Careful," she cautioned, setting down the bowl to help him. Her hands were gentle but firm as she arranged pillows behind him. Their faces were close as she settled him against the pillows. In the clear light of morning, Sarah could see details she'd missed in the chaos of the night. The intricate beadwork on the leather cord around his neck, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the proud set of his features that hinted at noble bearing. Who was this child, and how had he come to be shot and abandoned at the edge of her property? As if in answer to her unspoken question, the distant thunder of hoofbeats suddenly reached her ears. Not the storm returning, but something far more ominous. Riders. many of them coming fast. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The hoofbeats grew louder, an approaching storm of a different kind. She moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the faded curtain as she peered outside. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Riders emerged from the morning mist that clung to the distant hills, not just a few, dozens, perhaps 100. They approached in formation, a sea of mounted warriors, with painted faces and adorned in the traditional garb of Apache warriors. Feathers and beads caught the morning light. Spears and shields were held aloft, not yet raised in threat, but unmistakable in their purpose. "My God," Sarah whispered, fingers clutching the curtain. Behind her, the cot creaked. She turned to find Nakohe struggling to sit upright, his face a mixture of pain and something else, recognition. "You know them," Sarah said, the statement unnecessary. Of course he knew them. They had come for him. Nakohe nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. Then, with effort that clearly cost him, he swung his legs over the side of the cot. "No, you shouldn't," Sarah began, moving toward him. But Nakohe held up a hand, his expression solemn. "I go," he said, the words heavily accented but clear. Sarah understood then. He wasn't just a random Apache child who had wandered onto her land. He was someone important to these people, important enough that they would come in force to find him. The riders were close now, close enough that Sarah could make out the features of the man who led them. He sat taller than the others upon a magnificent black stallion. His face was painted with red and white stripes, and atop his head was an elaborate headdress of eagle feathers that caught the golden rays of the rising sun. There was a regal quality to his bearing, an authority that needed no announcement, a chief. And something in the set of his jaw, the proud angle of his head, reminded her forcefully of the boy who now stood beside her, leaning heavily on the bedpost for support. "Your father?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Nakohe nodded once, pride evident in his posture despite his weakness. Sarah's mind raced. She had saved the son of an Apache chief. The implications were staggering. These men might see her as a captor rather than a healer. They might burn her cabin to the ground, take her life as retribution for perceived wrongs. Or they might be grateful, but gratitude could be a complicated thing between enemies. The riders halted just beyond her property line, forming a semicircle that faced her small cabin. The message was clear. They had her surrounded. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, more to herself than to Nakohe. The boy straightened as much as his wound would allow. "We go outside," he said simply. Sarah hesitated, fear a cold knot in her stomach. But what choice did she have? Barricading herself inside would only delay the inevitable and might be seen as an act of hostility. "All right," she agreed, moving to help support him. "But carefully, you'll tear your stitches." Together, they made their slow way to the door. Sarah was acutely aware of the boy's warmth against her side, the slight trembling of his limbs from weakness, the smell of herbs and medicine that clung to him. Last night, she had seen him only as a wounded child. Now, she saw him as a bridge between worlds, and perhaps her only chance at survival. Sarah pushed open the door. The morning sunlight was blinding after the dimness of the cabin. She blinked, adjusting to the brightness as they stepped onto the porch. Nakohe straightened beside her, releasing his grip on her arm, determined to stand on his own despite his weakness. For a long moment, silence reigned. The warriors were still as statues, their faces unreadable. Only the chief moved, guiding his horse forward at a walk until he was just yards from the porch. Up close, his presence was even more imposing. Broad shoulders, a face etched with the lines of leadership and hardship, eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes went first to his son, assessing his condition with the scrutiny of both a warrior and a father. Then they turned to Sarah, piercing in their intensity. "Father," Nakohe said, his voice stronger than it had been inside. He spoke several sentences in Apache, gesturing first to his wound, then to Sarah. The chief's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. He raised a hand, and behind him, his warriors lowered their weapons slightly, not putting them away, but no longer holding them at the ready. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, the English heavily accented but clear. "My son says you found him, saved him." Sarah swallowed hard. "Yes," she answered, straightforward in the face of his directness. "He was shot. I brought him to my home and tended his wound." The chief studied her, taking in her simple dress, her hands that bore the calluses of hard work, the determination in her stance despite her fear. "I am Tokala," he said finally, "chief of the Mescalero Apache. This is my only son, Nakohe." Sarah inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Udaim Sarah Wilkins." Tokala dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements those of a man accustomed to authority. The warriors behind him remained mounted, watchful. "Who shot my son?" he asked, his tone making it clear he expected an answer. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. I found him at the edge of my property, already wounded." Tokala's eyes narrowed slightly. "You did not think to ask. He was unconscious for much of the night," Sarah replied, "and we don't share many words." A hint of something, perhaps approval, flickered across Tokala's face. "Yet you helped him, knowing what he is." "I helped him because he is a child," Sarah said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I was a nurse during the war. I couldn't leave him to die." Tokala took a step forward, close enough now that Sarah could see the individual lines etched around his eyes, the small scar that cut across his chin, so similar to the one that marked his son's eyebrow. "Many of your people would have," he said quietly. Sarah didn't deny it. They both knew the truth of his words. Nakohe spoke again in Apache, his voice growing weaker. Sarah felt him sway slightly beside her and instinctively placed a steadying hand on his arm. Tokala's eyes caught the movement. A subtle shift in his posture conveyed a decision made. "My son needs rest," he said, "and we have much to discuss. Sarah Wilkins." The way he said her name, deliberate, giving weight to each syllable, sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't over. In fact, she suspected it had only just begun. Tokala spoke a sharp command, and two warriors dismounted immediately. They approached the porch with measured steps, their eyes never leaving Sarah. She fought the instinct to back away as they drew near, reminding herself that any sign of fear might be misinterpreted as guilt or deception. "They will bring my son inside," Tokala explained, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sarah nodded, stepping aside to allow the warriors to support Nakohe between them. The boy's face had grown pale with the effort of standing, but his expression remained stoic, unwilling to show weakness. As the warriors guided him back into the cabin, Nakohe glanced over his shoulder at Sarah, his eyes conveying a silent message she couldn't quite decipher. Tokala turned to the remaining warriors and issued a series of commands in Apache. The response was immediate. The large group dispersed, some taking up positions around the perimeter of her property, others dismounting to tend to the horses, and a small contingent riding back toward the hills from which they had emerged. "What are they doing?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the apprehension from her voice. "Setting camp," Tokala replied simply. "We do not leave until my son can ride." The declaration hung in the air between them. Sarah's mind whirled with implications. 100 Apache warriors camping on her land. What would the neighbors think? The nearest homestead was 5 miles away, but word would spread. And when it did, "Your neighbors will not come," Tokala said, reading her thoughts with unsettling accuracy. "My scouts watch the trails. No one approaches without my knowledge." Sarah stiffened. I wasn't worried about my neighbors." A ghost of a smile touched Tokala's lips. "You are brave, Sarah Wilkins, or perhaps foolish. Sometimes these are the same thing." He gestured toward the cabin door. "Shall we?" It was phrased as a question, but Sarah recognized it as the command it was. She preceded him into her home, acutely aware of his presence behind her, tall, formidable, a force barely contained within human form. Inside, the 2 warriors had settled Nakohe back on the cot. One of them was examining the wound, his expression unreadable as he inspected Sarah's handiwork. Tokala spoke to them, and they responded with short phrases and gestures toward the bandages. "Your medicine is strange to us," Tokala said, turning back to Sarah. "But my son lives. This speaks well of your skill." Sarah moved to the stove, needing something to do with her hands. It's a combination of what I learned during the war and from a Navajo woman who passed through here once. I don't know if it's right or wrong by your standards, but it was the best I could do." She lit the stove and placed the kettle on to boil. "Would you like coffee?" she asked, the mundane question feeling absurd under the circumstances, yet somehow necessary, a small attempt to establish normalcy in this extraordinary situation. Tokala studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Yes." The 2 warriors exited the cabin at a silent command from their chief, leaving the 3 of them alone. Tokala moved to stand beside his son, speaking softly in Apache. Nakohe responded weakly, his eyes drifting closed. Within moments, he had fallen asleep, exhausted by the events of the morning. Sarah busied herself with the coffee, giving father and son what privacy she could in the confines of her small home. When she turned back, Tokala was seated in the chair she had occupied through the night, his large frame making it seem small and delicate. "He says you stayed awake all night," Tokala said. Watching over him, Sarah poured the coffee into 2 tin cups. The fever was high. "I was afraid he might," she trailed off, unwilling to speak of death. "Die," Tokala finished for her. "Yes, a gunshot can kill quickly or slowly. Both are bad ways to die." He accepted the cup she offered, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. His were calloused, scarred, the hands of a warrior, not unlike her own, which bore the marks of hard work and survival. "Who would shoot a child?" Sarah asked, the question that had plagued her through the long night finally finding voice. Tokala's expression darkened. "Men who see no children, only Apache." "He's just a boy," Sarah said, the injustice of it burning in her chest. "To you, perhaps." Tokala took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "To them, he is the son of Tokala, future chief of the Mescalero. A threat to be eliminated before he becomes a man." The blunt assessment sent a chill through Sarah. "You think he was targeted specifically, not just encountered by chance?" "There is no chance in this," Tokala replied. 3 days ago, I met with your army officers to discuss peace terms. Some men do not want peace." Sarah sat at the small table, turning this information over in her mind. "You're saying someone shot your son to sabotage peace talks? It would not be the first time blood was spilled to prevent understanding between our peoples." The implication hung heavy in the air. Sarah had heard whispers, of course, rumors of certain factions within both the military and civilian population who preferred conflict to coexistence, who stood to profit from continued warfare against the Apache. Nakohe was returning from a vision quest, Tokala continued, his voice low so as not to disturb his sleeping son. A ritual for boys becoming men. He was alone, as is our way. An easy target. How did you find him? Sarah asked. How did you know he was here? A faint smile touched Tokala's lips. The storm washed away many tracks, but not all. My trackers are the best among our people. And he hesitated, something Sarah wouldn't have expected from such a commanding presence. And, she prompted, I saw it, Tokala said simply. In a dream, my son, wounded but alive, in a white woman's cabin. When he did not return from his quest, I knew the dream was a vision. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to this. Her Protestant upbringing hadn't prepared her for conversations about prophetic dreams with Apache chiefs. You think I speak nonsense? Tokala observed, no offense in his tone. No, Sarah replied carefully. I think there are many things in this world I don't understand, things beyond my experience. Tokala seemed satisfied with this answer. He drained his cup and set it aside, then rose to his feet in one fluid motion. My people will make camp at the edge of your land. We will not disturb your animals or your crops. He looked toward Nahkohe. I would have my son remain here, where he has begun to heal, if you permit it. The request, for it was a request, not a command, surprised Sarah. Of course, she said without hesitation. He shouldn't be moved until the wound has had more time to heal. Tokala inclined his head in acknowledgement. I will send our medicine man to see him. Perhaps your medicines and ours together will speed his recovery. He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to face her. Why did you help him, Sarah Wilkins? The truth. Sarah met his gaze steadily, because it was the right thing to do. Because I've seen too much death already. Because when I found him, I didn't see an Apache boy. I just saw a child who needed help. Tokala studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, as if confirming something to himself. You have the heart of a warrior, he said, even if you carry no weapon. With that, he stepped outside, leaving Sarah alone with the sleeping boy and the strange sensation that her life had just been irrevocably altered. By midday, Sarah's homestead had transformed. Conical skin lodges now dotted the southern edge of her property, smoke from cooking fires rising in thin columns against the blue sky. Apache women had arrived with the second group of riders, bringing supplies and setting up camp with practiced efficiency. Children darted between the lodges, their curious eyes occasionally straying toward Sarah's cabin before being called back by watchful mothers. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching this strange new world unfold on her land. It was surreal, like waking to find her small corner of Arizona territory had somehow merged with another realm entirely. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Outside stood an elderly Apache man, his weathered face a testament to years spent under the harsh desert sun. Beside him was Tokala, his imposing presence now familiar in a way Sarah wouldn't have thought possible mere hours ago. This is Makia, Tokala said, our medicine man. He wishes to see my son. Sarah stepped aside to allow them entry. Of course. Makia moved with the deliberate pace of age, yet there was nothing frail about him. He carried a fringed leather bag from which various herbs protruded, their scent both foreign and oddly comforting. He nodded to Sarah with dignity rather than deference, one healer acknowledging another. Nakohi was awake, propped up on pillows and sipping from a cup of broth Sarah had prepared. His eyes brightened at the sight of the old medicine man. and he spoke a few words of greeting in Apache. Makia set his bag beside the cot and began examining Nakohe's wound with gnarled but gentle fingers. As he worked, he spoke softly, his words unintelligible to Sarah but clearly reassuring to the boy. Occasionally, Makia would pause and remove an herb or root from his bag, holding it up to his nose before placing it aside. "He asks if he may use some of his medicines alongside yours," Tokala translated. Sarah nodded. "I'd welcome it. My knowledge is limited." Makia glanced up at her words, his dark eyes assessing. Though he didn't speak English, he seemed to understand the sentiment behind her response. He reached into his bag and produced a small stone mortar and pestle, then began grinding a mixture of herbs with practiced movements. "What is he making?" Sarah asked, curiosity overcoming her reticence. Tokala watched the old man work. "A poultice to draw out sickness and speed healing. The plants he uses grow only in the high mountains. They are sacred to our people." Sarah moved closer, observing the fine powder that resulted from Makia's grinding. "My poultice is made from yarrow and comfrey," she offered, "and a little honey to keep infection away." Makia paused, looking up at her words. He spoke to Tokala, who translated, "He says these are good plants. Your medicine is not so different from ours." A small smile touched Sarah's lips. "I suppose some truths are universal." When Makia finished preparing his medicine, he motioned for Sarah to come closer. With Tokala translating, he explained how to apply the poultice and how often it should be changed. To Sarah's surprise, he incorporated her honey into his mixture, nodding approvingly at the suggestion. Together, they removed the old dressing from Nakohe's wound. Sarah was pleased to see it looked cleaner than it had the night before, with no signs of serious infection. Makia applied his poultice with deft fingers, then allowed Sarah to wrap fresh bandages around the boy's torso. Throughout the procedure, Nakohe remained stoic, though pain occasionally flashed across his features. When they finished, Makia spoke directly to the boy, his tone stern but kind. Nakohe nodded solemnly in response. "What did he say?" Sarah asked once Makia had stepped away to wash his hands in the basin she provided. "That Nakohe must be patient," Tokala replied. "The body heals at its own pace, not ours, a lesson my son has always found difficult." Sarah smiled at that. "All boys his age are the same, I think, too eager to be men." A thoughtful expression crossed Tokala's face. "You have sons?" "No," Sarah said, the single word containing a wealth of unexpressed sorrow. "My husband and I, we had hoped, but—" She busied herself with clearing away the used bandages, uncomfortable with the unexpected vulnerability. Tokala did not press further, but his gaze lingered on her, seeing more than she wished to reveal. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a single rider coming fast. One of Tokala's warriors appeared at the door, speaking rapidly in Apache. Tokala's expression hardened. "What is it?" Sarah asked, tension returning to her shoulders. "A white man approaches from the east," Tokala said. "One of your neighbors, I believe." Sarah moved to the window. In the distance, she could make out a familiar figure on horseback, Emmett Walsh, whose ranch lay 5 miles to the east. He was riding hard, his gaze fixed on the Apache encampment with visible alarm. "It's Emmett," she confirmed. "He probably saw the smoke from your fires." Tokala issued a command to his warrior, who departed swiftly. "My men will not stop him, but they will watch him closely." Sarah grabbed her shawl from a hook by the door. "I should speak to him before he gets too close. Emmett can be hot-headed." "I will come with you," Tokala said, his tone brooking no argument. Outside, Emmett had reined his horse to a stop at the edge of Sarah's property. His hand hovered near the revolver at his hip, his weathered face a mask of disbelief and anger as he surveyed the Apache camp. "Sarah!" he called out when he spotted her emerging from the cabin. "Get back inside." "I'll ride for help." Before she could respond, his eyes landed on Takala, who stood tall beside her. Emmett's face drained of color, his hand now firmly gripping his revolver. "Step away from her, you red devil!" he shouted, drawing his weapon. Sarah moved forward quickly, placing herself between Emmett and Takala. "Put that away, Emmett Walsh. These people are under my protection." The words, spoken on instinct, surprised even her. Behind her, she felt rather than saw Takala's reaction, a subtle shift in his posture that might have been surprise or approval. Emmett stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Have you gone crazy, woman? They'll scalp you in your sleep." "No one is scalping anyone," Sarah said firmly. "Now put that gun away before someone gets hurt, and let me explain." Emmett Walsh's knuckles whitened around the grip of his revolver, his weathered face a battleground of emotions, disbelief, fear, and righteous anger fighting for dominance. Behind Sarah, Takala remained perfectly still, a statue carved of bronze and dignity. Only his eyes moved, scanning the surrounding area where his warriors had melted into the landscape like shadows at noon. "Lower your weapon, Emmett," Sarah repeated, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "No one here wishes you harm." "Have they bewitched you?" Emmett demanded, but uncertainty had crept into his tone. His eyes darted between Sarah and the imposing figure of Takala. "Or are they holding you hostage? Blink twice if you can't speak freely." Despite the gravity of the situation, Sarah nearly laughed at the absurdity. "I'm not bewitched or held hostage. I'm trying to prevent bloodshed, yours included." She took a cautious step toward Emmett's horse. "These people are here because I helped one of their children, a boy who was shot and left for dead on my property." Emmett's gaze flickered to the cabin behind her. "You brought an Apache into your home. After what happened to the Hendersons? This boy had nothing to do with the Hendersons," Sarah said firmly, though she had no way of knowing if that was true. "He's just a child, Emmett. 12 years old at most. Would you have me leave him to die?" Takala stepped forward, his movement so sudden that Emmett's gun swung toward him instinctively. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "I am Takala, chief of the Mescalero Apache," he said, his deep voice carrying across the space between them. "The boy is my son. This woman saved his life. For this, she has the protection of my people." Emmett's eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly for a moment. "Chief, your son?" He looked to Sarah for confirmation, and she nodded. "Lower your weapon, Emmett," she said again. "Want to come inside, have some coffee, and let me explain everything?" For a tense moment, Sarah thought he might refuse. Then, slowly, he holstered his revolver. "I'll listen," he said grudgingly, "but I'm keeping my hand near my gun." "Fair enough," Sarah conceded, relief washing through her. Emmett dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post with movements made jerky by lingering tension. He followed Sarah toward the cabin, keeping a wary distance from Takala, who walked beside her with measured steps. Inside, Nakohe was asleep again. The combination of Makia's medicines and his body's need for healing, having overcome his youthful resistance to rest, the old medicine man sat in the corner, sorting through his herbs with methodical patience. He glanced up when they entered but continued his work without comment. Emmett stopped short at the sight of the sleeping boy, his expression conflicted. Sarah had known Emmett for 3 years, since she and Thomas had first settled on this land. He was a hard man, but not a cruel one. He had helped her repair her roof after Thomas died, had brought her venison when his hunts were successful. Now she watched emotions war across his face as he took in the reality of the wounded child. "Coffee?" Sarah offered, already moving toward the stove. Emmett nodded mutely, settling himself at the small table with obvious reluctance. His eyes never left Takala, who remained standing, his presence filling the modest cabin. "The boy was shot 2 days ago," Sarah explained as she prepared the coffee. "I found him during the storm last night, brought him here, and tended his wound as best I could. And them." Emmett jerked his chin toward the window, indicating the encampment beyond. "They arrived this morning, tracking their chief's son," Sarah said. "They mean no harm to anyone who means no harm to them," Emmett snorted. That's not how it works with their kind." Takala's expression remained impassive, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "It is exactly how it works," he said quietly. "We did not start this war. We did not come to your lands seeking conquest." "Tell that to the Hendersons," Emmett retorted. "The Hendersons," Takala said deliberately, "were selling rifles to the Comanche, who used them against my people. They were not innocent in this conflict." This revelation landed like a stone in still water. Sarah's hands stilled in the act of pouring coffee. "Is that true?" Emmett's silence was answer enough. He took the cup Sarah offered, avoiding her gaze. "You knew," she said, the betrayal sharp in her chest. "You knew what they were doing." "I suspected," Emmett admitted reluctantly. But that doesn't justify..." "It justifies nothing," Takala interrupted. "It explains. There is a difference." An uncomfortable silence settled over the cabin, broken only by Nakohe's steady breathing and the soft rustling of Makya's herbs. Finally, Emmett sighed heavily. "What happens now?" he asked, directing the question to Sarah. "You can't expect to host an Apache war party indefinitely. We remain until my son can travel," Takala stated. 3 days, perhaps 4, then we go." "And what about the army?" Emmett challenged. "They've got patrols all through this territory looking for your band." A thin smile curved Takala's lips. "They look, but they do not find unless we wish to be found." Emmett drained his coffee in one long swallow, then set the cup down with a decisive clunk. "The others will need to know about this. Mason, the Petersons, Old Man Crawford. If they ride up here and see this..." He gestured toward the window again. "They'll be shooting before anyone can explain." Sarah exchanged a glance with Takala. Emmett was right, and they both knew it. "Would tell them," Sarah said finally. "But make them understand the situation. These people are my guests. Anyone who can't respect that should stay away until they've moved on." Emmett stared at her in disbelief. "Your guests? Sarah, they're Apache warriors. Do you have any idea what kind of danger you're putting yourself in? What kind of danger you're bringing down on all of us?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," Sarah replied, surprised to find it was true. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, she felt more certain of this course than she had of anything since Thomas's death. "And I'm asking you, as my friend and neighbor, to help me prevent a tragedy." Emmett stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'll tell them," he said after a long moment. But I can't promise they'll listen. And if things go south..." He paused, glancing at Takala. "I won't be responsible for what happens." "You speak as if your people are the only ones who might suffer," Takala observed, his tone even but with an undercurrent of steel. "Remember that my son lies wounded by a white man's bullet. We have shown restraint. We expect the same in return." The two men locked eyes across the small space, alpha wolves from different packs, neither willing to show submission. Finally, Emmett looked away. "I'll do what I can," he said to Sarah, "but you'd best keep your rifle loaded, just in case." He moved toward the door, pausing on the threshold. "I'll be back tomorrow," he added. with supplies. You've got a lot more mouths to feed than you planned for. The offer, grudging though it was, surprised Sarah. Thank you, Emmett. He nodded once, cast a final glance at the sleeping Nakohe, then departed. Through the window, Sarah watched him mount his horse and ride away, his back straight with tension. He will bring others, Tokala said, not a question but a statement. Sarah turned to face him. Yes. But whether they come as friends or enemies depends on what he tells them and how they choose to hear it. Tokala studied her with those fathomless dark eyes. You trust this man? I trust that he wants to avoid bloodshed, Sarah replied carefully. Whether that's enough, we'll see. Outside, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon. The Apache camp had grown quiet, the women preparing evening meals, warriors standing guard at strategic points around the perimeter. It was an uneasy peace, fragile as spun glass. Sarah knew that by this time tomorrow, everything could change. The delicate balance they had established could shatter with a single misspoken word, a single impulsive action. Yet despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, she felt oddly at peace with her decision. She had chosen to save a child's life. Whatever came next, she would face it knowing that much, at least, had been right. Night fell like a velvet cloak over the homestead, stars emerging in brilliant clarity against the desert sky. Sarah stood on her porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill, watching the flickering fires of the Apache camp. The soft murmur of unfamiliar voices carried on the breeze, punctuated occasionally by the laughter of children or the melodic notes of a bone flute. It should have felt threatening, this encampment of so-called enemies mere yards from her door. Instead, Sarah found herself drawn to the rhythm and life of it, so different from the isolation she had grown accustomed to since Thomas's death. The cabin door opened behind her. Tokala stepped out, his movements silent despite his imposing frame. He joined her at the porch railing, his gaze following hers to the camp below. Your people have made themselves at home, Sarah observed, no judgment in her tone. They feel safe here, Tokala replied. It has been many moons since we could say this. The simple statement carried the weight of years of conflict, of lives lived in constant vigilance. Sarah turned to study his profile, strong and proud against the night sky. And you, she asked, do you feel safe here? Tokala considered the question. I feel curious. About what? About you, Sarah Wilkins. He turned to face her fully. A woman alone, who takes in an Apache child without fear, who stands before armed men to protect him. You are not like other white women I have encountered. Perhaps you haven't encountered many, Sarah suggested, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. More than you might think, Tokala countered. I was educated at a mission school before I returned to my people. I speak your language. I have read your books. I understand your ways better than most of my kind. This revelation surprised Sarah. She had assumed his command of English was learned through necessity rather than formal education. Then you know we're not all the same, she said, just as your people aren't all the same. A smile touched Tokala's lips, barely visible in the moonlight. This is true, and yet you are still different. Before Sarah could respond, movement at the edge of the property caught her attention. Torchlight flickered among the trees, and the sound of multiple horses approached. Tokala had seen it too. He straightened, instantly alert. Stay here, he commanded, moving swiftly down the porch steps. But Sarah was already following him. This is my land, she reminded him. My responsibility. Warriors emerged from the shadows, weapons ready but not yet raised. Women hurried children into the lodges, their movements practiced and efficient. Tokala issued orders in rapid Apache, and the warriors formed a loose semicircle, a living barrier between the approaching riders and the camp. The riders emerged from the darkness, 5 men on horseback, led by Emmett Walsh. Behind him rode James Mason, whose cattle ranch sprawled to the north, the Peterson brothers, whose homestead bordered Mason's land, and Old Man Crawford, who despite his 70 years was still one of the finest shots in the territory. They halted their horses at the edge of Sarah's property, torches casting long shadows across the dusty ground. Emmett dismounted first, approaching on foot with his hands deliberately visible at his sides. "Sarah," he called, his voice carrying in the still night air. "We need to talk." Sarah moved forward to meet him, conscious of Tokala's presence just behind her right shoulder. "You've brought company, I see." "Folks were concerned," Emmett said, his tone carefully neutral. "Wanted to see the situation for themselves." James Mason spoke up from atop his horse. "This true, Sarah?" "You're harboring Apache. I'm caring for a wounded child," Sarah replied evenly. "His people are waiting until he's well enough to travel. That child will grow into a warrior who'll raid our homes and murder our families." The elder Peterson brother spat. "You're nurturing a viper." "Mind your tongue," Tokala said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable threat. "You speak of my son." The younger Peterson's hand moved toward his rifle. "And you'd be the chief, I reckon, the one they call Tokala." "I am," Tokala acknowledged, his posture relaxed, yet somehow radiating dangerous potential. Old Man Crawford leaned forward in his saddle. "Heard tell you were meeting with the army about peace terms. That true?" Tokala's gaze shifted to the elderly man. "It is. 3 days ago, before my son was shot. Convenient timing," the elder Peterson muttered. "Thomas," Emmett warned, casting a sharp look at the man. He turned back to Sarah. "We brought supplies like I promised. Flour, coffee, salt pork. Figure you could use it." Sarah was touched by the gesture, unexpected given the clear hostility emanating from at least some of the men. "Thank you." "There's conditions," Mason interjected. "We'll help you out, Sarah, because you're one of us. But these Apache need to be gone in 3 days. No more." Tokala's expression remained impassive, but Sarah felt the tension radiating from him. "My son's healing cannot be rushed to suit your schedule," he said. "He rides when he is ready, not before." 3 days, Mason repeated firmly. "Or we'll bring the army patrol from Fort Grant to escort you out." The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Around them, Apache warriors had inched closer, their hands on weapons, awaiting their chief's command. "There's no need for threats," Sarah said, stepping deliberately between the two groups. "Nakohe is healing well. In 3 days, we can assess whether he's fit to travel. If he is, they'll leave peacefully. If not..." She fixed Mason with a steady gaze. "Then I expect my neighbors to show the same Christian charity they'd once shown to their own children?" Crawford snorted, but there was a glint of respect in his rheumy eyes. "The widow's got spine, I'll give her that." 3 days, Mason conceded after a moment, "but we'll be watching. Any sign of trouble, and the deal's off." As the men unloaded the promised supplies from their pack horses, Sarah felt Tokala's presence close behind her. "You bargain with my son's life," he said softly, for her ears only. Sarah turned to face him. "I'm trying to prevent bloodshed. Give me the 3 days, and I'll make sure Nakohe is strong enough to travel." Tokala studied her face in the torchlight, searching for something, trustworthiness, perhaps, or deception. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, for he gave a single, curt nod. 3 days, he agreed. A dinner, but if my son suffers for this bargain, there will be a reckoning. The words were not spoken as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, like describing the sunrise or the changing of seasons. Some things were immutable, beyond negotiation. Sarah understood this, and as she watched the settlers depart, she prayed she had not just made a promise she couldn't keep. Dawn of the second day broke with copper light streaking across the horizon. Sarah had slept little, her mind too full of the previous night's confrontation and the weight of the promise she'd made. 3 days to heal a boy from a gunshot wound, a task that would challenge even the most skilled physician, let alone a former field nurse with limited supplies. She found Nakohe awake when she entered the main room, propped against his pillows and watching the morning light creep across the floorboards. His dark eyes, so like his father's, turned to her with a quiet intelligence that belied his years. "Good morning," Sarah said, smiling despite her fatigue. "How do you feel today?" Nakohe considered the question, his hand moving to rest lightly on his bandaged side. "Better," he replied, his English still halting but improving with each exchange. "Not so much pain." "That's good." Sarah moved to the stove, stoking the fire and setting water to boil for coffee and porridge. "We need to change your bandages after breakfast. Makya's medicine seems to be working well." The boy nodded, his gaze following her movements with curious interest. "You look tired," he observed unexpectedly. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, surprised by his perceptiveness. I didn't sleep well, because of the men who came." "Yes," Sarah admitted, seeing no reason to shield him from the truth. "Your father and I made an agreement with them. You have 3 days to get strong enough to travel." Nakohe's expression hardened, a glimpse of the warrior he would one day become. "I can travel now. I am not weak." "It's not about weakness," Sarah said gently. "It's about healing properly. If you tear your wound open on horseback, you could bleed to death before your father can get you home." The boy fell silent, absorbing this. Then, with obvious reluctance, he nodded. 3 days. I will be ready." The cabin door opened as Tokala entered, his tall frame seeming to fill the small space. He had been conferring with his warriors since before sunrise, his voice a distant murmur that Sarah had heard through her open window. "My son speaks the truth," Tokala said, having overheard their conversation. "He will be ready." Sarah met his gaze over the rim of the coffee cup she was filling. "Not if it means risking his life." "The risk may be greater if we stay," Tokala countered. "Your neighbor's patience has limits." "So does the human body's ability to heal," Sarah replied firmly. She handed him a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing in the exchange. A brief, electric moment of contact. "I won't send him off to die on the trail just to appease James Mason." Something flickered in Tokala's eyes, respect, perhaps, or surprise at her defiance. He accepted the coffee with a slight inclination of his head. "And then we must work together to ensure he heals quickly." "Agreed." Nakohe watched this exchange with keen interest, his gaze moving between his father and the white woman who had saved his life. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, quickly suppressed when his father glanced his way. After breakfast, Sarah and Makya changed Nakohe's bandages together. The wound looked significantly better. The angry redness had faded, and new tissue was forming at the edges of the entry and exit wounds. The old medicine man nodded approvingly as he applied a fresh poultice, murmuring words in Apache that Sarah couldn't understand but recognized as encouragement. "Makya says you have healing hands," Tokala translated from where he stood watching. "It is a rare gift among our people, those who can mend rather than break. I was a nurse during the war, Sarah explained, helping Nakohe sit forward so she could wrap clean bandages around his torso. I saw too much breaking. I prefer mending when I can. Which war? Nakohe asked, surprising her with his interest. The war between the states, Sarah replied. North against South. I treated wounded soldiers from both sides. Why fight? The boy pressed. Same people, same land. Sarah sighed, securing the bandage with a small knot. That's a very good question, Nakohe. Sometimes I think men just forget how to talk to each other. It's easier to fight than to understand. This is true of all men, Tokala said quietly, not just your people. Their eyes met again, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were not so different after all, both leaders in their own way, both responsible for those who depended on them, both weary of conflict. Later that morning, as Nakohe rested, Sarah ventured outside to tend to her chickens and check on the garden she had planted weeks before. To her surprise, several Apache women were already there, carefully weeding between the rows of young vegetables and reinforcing the fence that kept rabbits at bay. They wished to help, Tokala explained, appearing beside her as silently as a shadow, to repay your kindness to my son. Sarah watched as one woman showed another how to identify which plants were weeds and which were crops. They don't have to do that. It is our way, Tokala said simply. A debt must be honored. They walked together toward the chicken coop, where Sarah scattered feed for the clucking hens. The normalcy of the task felt strange against the backdrop of such extraordinary circumstances. Did your scouts find anything? Sarah asked, broaching the subject that had hung unspoken between them. About who shot Nakohe? Tokala's expression darkened. Tracks leading west toward Fort Grant. But the rain washed away much evidence. You think it was soldiers, or men who want us to think it was soldiers. Tokala watched a hawk circling high above them. There are those on both sides who profit from war, Sarah Wilkins. Peace threatens their power. Sarah considered this. The peace talks you mentioned, were they official? Yes, with Colonel Harrington of Fort Grant. Tokala's jaw tightened. He seemed honorable. But not all his men share his vision, and not all Apache want peace either, Sarah guessed. A thin smile touched Tokala's lips. You see clearly. Yes, there are young men in my tribe who believe fighting is the only way. They say I grow weak with age, that I forget the blood of our people that stains this land. Is that why Nakohe was on his vision quest, to prove something? Tokala looked at her sharply. How did you know this? Sarah shrugged. It wasn't hard to guess. He's at that age where boys need to prove themselves men. I've seen it before. Tokala was silent for a long moment. My son wishes to walk a warrior's path. I had hoped his vision might show him another way. And did it? Sarah asked gently. That is for him to share, when he is ready. Tokala's gaze drifted to the cabin where his son rested. But perhaps this experience will teach him that courage comes in many forms, not all of them violent. As the day progressed, Sarah was struck by how quickly the Apache had integrated themselves into the rhythms of her homestead. Women washed clothes at the stream that ran along the western edge of her property. Children played quiet games in the shade of the cottonwood trees. Warriors patrolled the perimeter, alert but not threatening. And through it all, Tokala moved with the quiet authority of a natural leader, settling disputes, organizing hunting parties, conferring with Makia about his son's progress. Sarah found her eyes drawn to him repeatedly, admiring the dignity with which he carried himself, the respect he commanded without raising his voice. As evening approached, Nakohe asked to sit outside, eager for fresh air after days confined to the cot. Sarah helped him to a chair on the porch, where he could watch the sunset and the activities of the camp below. His strength was returning, but he still tired easily, his young body focused on the demanding work of healing. "Will you tell me about your vision quest?" Sarah asked as they sat together, a light blanket draped over Nakohe's legs, despite the warmth of the evening. The boy looked surprised by her question. "It is private." "Sacred." "I understand," Sarah said, respecting his reticence. "My people have sacred things too." Nakohe was quiet for a time, watching as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I saw eagle," he said finally, "flying over mountains, free." Sarah nodded, sensing the significance of this confidence. "That sounds beautiful." "Then I heard shot," Nakohe continued, his voice dropping. "Felt fire in my side. Fell into darkness." His hand moved unconsciously to his wound. "I thought I would die alone." "But you didn't," Sarah said softly. Nakohe turned to look at her, his young face solemn. "No, you found me, like in father's dream." The simple statement hung between them in the evening air, laden with implications Sarah wasn't sure she fully understood. Before she could respond, Tokala appeared at the bottom of the porch steps, his expression unreadable as he observed them together. "2 days now remain," he said. "Tomorrow, my son must try to stand and walk. If he cannot, we face a difficult choice." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'll help him, but I won't let him leave if it means his death." Something flickered in Tokala's eyes, a mixture of gratitude and another emotion Sarah couldn't quite name. "Nor would I ask it of him, or of you." As night fell over the homestead, Sarah found herself wondering what would happen when the 3 days were up. Would the settlers honor their word if Nakohe needed more time? Would Tokala risk confrontation to protect his son? And beneath these practical concerns lay a more personal question, one Sarah was only beginning to acknowledge. What would she do when these people who had so unexpectedly entered her life rode away again? The answers remained as elusive as the stars that now emerged one by one in the darkening sky, present but just beyond reach. The 3rd day dawned with a sky streaked purple and crimson, the sun not yet visible beyond the eastern hills. Sarah stood at her window, watching as the Apache camp stirred to life in the half-light. Women rekindled cooking fires, warriors returned from night watches, children emerged sleepy-eyed from lodges. The scene had become almost familiar over the past 48 hours, a temporary village that had transformed her isolated homestead into something vibrant and alive. Today was the day of reckoning. The deadline set by her neighbors loomed like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and potentially devastating. Sarah turned from the window to check on Nakohe, who still slept on the cot, his breathing deep and regular. The fever had not returned, and the wound showed no signs of infection. By any measure, his healing was progressing remarkably well. But was it enough? Sarah's medical training told her that moving him too soon risked reopening the wound, causing internal bleeding, or worse. Yet keeping him here beyond the agreed-upon deadline risked a different kind of danger, one that could engulf not just Nakohe, but all of Tokala's people. The cabin door opened quietly as Makya entered, his ancient face solemn in the dim light. He nodded a greeting to Sarah, then moved to Nakohe's side, placing a gnarled hand on the boy's forehead. The old medicine man had taken to arriving early each morning, checking on his patient before the day's activities began in earnest. "How is he?" Sarah asked, knowing Makia wouldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone conveyed the question. To her surprise, the old man responded in halting English, "Strong." "Spirit fight hard." Sarah blinked in astonishment. "You speak English." A ghost of a smile crossed Makia's weathered features. "Little, learn long ago, mission school." Like Tokala, Sarah realized. Perhaps they had attended together in their youth. "Can he travel today?" she asked, gesturing toward Nakohe, who was beginning to stir. Makia's expression grew serious again. He made a rocking motion with his hand, the gesture for horseback riding, then shook his head. "Not good. Need more time." Sarah's heart sank, though she had expected this answer. "How much more time?" The old man held up 2 fingers. 2 days, maybe 3. Nearly double the deadline they had been given. Sarah nodded her understanding, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She would need to speak with Tokala immediately. As if summoned by her thoughts, the Apache chief appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene with a single glance. Makia's solemn expression, Sarah's worried frown, his son blinking awake on the cot. "You have news," he said, not a question, but a statement. Sarah met his gaze directly. "Makia says he needs at least 2 more days of rest before he can safely travel." Tokala's expression remained impassive, but Sarah had come to recognize the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes that betrayed concern. "The agreement was 3 days," he said. "Today is the 3rd. "I know." Sarah moved closer, lowering her voice, though Nakohe was now awake and watching them with keen interest. "But rushing his recovery could kill him, Tokala. I won't be party to that." The chief studied her face, searching for something, weakness, perhaps, or deception. Finding neither, he inclined his head slightly. "What do you propose?" "I'll speak to Emmett and the others," Sarah said. "Explain the situation, ask for more time. And if they refuse?" The question hung between them, laden with implications neither wished to voice aloud. "Then we'll face that challenge when it comes," Sarah replied. "But I believe they can be reasoned with." A skeptical look crossed Tokala's features. "You have more faith in your people than I do, Sarah Wilkins." "Not faith," she corrected. "Hope, and perhaps a better understanding of what motivates them." Nakohe sat up carefully, wincing slightly with the movement. "I can ride," he insisted, his young voice determined. "I am not afraid of pain." Tokala turned to his son, his expression softening. "It is not about fear, my son. A warrior knows when to push forward and when to wait for the right moment." "I want to try," Nakohe persisted. "Let me stand, at least. Show what I can do." Sarah and Tokala exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Sarah nodded. "All right." But slowly, and only for a few minutes, with Tokala supporting one side and Sarah the other, Nakohe eased himself to his feet. He stood unsteadily, his face pale with the effort, but there was determination in the set of his jaw. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he took a tentative step, then another. "See?" he said, his voice strained but triumphant. "I can walk. Walking around a cabin is not the same as riding for miles across rough country," Sarah cautioned, "and your wound could reopen with any sudden movement." Nakohe looked up at his father, a silent plea in his eyes. Tokala's expression remained stern, but his hand on his son's shoulder conveyed pride. "You have shown courage," he told the boy. "Now show wisdom by listening to those who know healing." The disappointment on Nakohe's face was palpable, but he nodded acceptance. As they helped him back to the cot, A commotion outside drew their attention, voices raised in alarm, the sound of horses approaching at speed. Tokala moved to the window, his body instantly alert. "Riders," he said, his voice tight. "Many, coming from the east." Sarah joined him at the window. Through the morning haze, she could make out a group of horsemen, at least a dozen, maybe more. They were still distant, but approaching rapidly. "It's too early," she said, alarm rising in her chest. "They weren't supposed to come until sundown." Tokala's expression hardened. They were never going to honor the agreement. He turned, issuing rapid commands in Apache to Makia, who hurried out the door to alert the camp. Within moments, the peaceful morning erupted into controlled chaos as warriors took up defensive positions and women gathered children into the center of the camp. "Stay with my son," Tokala instructed Sarah, already moving toward the door. "I will speak with these men." "No," Sarah said firmly, grabbing her shawl from its hook. "This is my land." "I'll speak with them." Tokala paused, studying her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to her very core. "They come with weapons and anger. It is too dangerous. All the more reason for me to go," Sarah insisted. "They might listen to me. To you, they'll only see an enemy." Before he could argue further, she moved past him onto the porch. The riders were close enough now that she could identify some of them. Emmett Walsh and James Mason at the front, the Peterson brothers just behind. But there were others she didn't recognize, men with hard faces and rifles held ready across their saddles. And riding alongside Mason, his blue uniform stark against the dust-colored landscape, was a soldier, a lieutenant, judging by his insignia. Sarah's heart sank. They had brought the army into this, after all. Tokala appeared beside her, his presence solid and reassuring despite the tension radiating from him. "The soldier is Lieutenant Davis," he said quietly. "A young man with ambition but little wisdom. He was at the peace talks." Sarah glanced at him in surprise. "You know him." "I know all my enemies," Tokala replied grimly. "And he is among the worst, one who speaks of peace while preparing for war." The riders pulled up short of the property line, their horses throwing up dust that hung in the still morning air. Emmett raised a hand in greeting, but his expression was troubled. "Sarah," he called, "we've come to escort the Apache off your land, as agreed." "You're early," Sarah replied, her voice carrying across the distance between them. "And you've brought uninvited guests." Lieutenant Davis urged his horse forward a few paces. He was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps no more than 25, with a neatly trimmed mustache and cold blue eyes. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness, "I'm Lieutenant Samuel Davis of the United States Army. I understand you've been harboring hostiles on your property." "I've been caring for a wounded child," Sarah corrected, her tone sharp. "With his father's permission." Davis's gaze shifted to Tokala, recognition and something like satisfaction flashing in his eyes. "Chief Tokala, we meet again." "Lieutenant." Tokala's acknowledgement was cool, controlled. "I'm afraid I must insist that you and your people vacate this area immediately," Davis continued, "by order of Colonel Harrington." "The boy is not yet well enough to travel," Sarah interjected. "As I was about to explain to my neighbors, he needs 2 more days of rest before he can safely ride." Davis's expression hardened. "Ma'am, these people are enemies of the United States government. They've raided settlements, ambushed patrols, and signed peace accords that your men violated," Tokala interrupted, his voice like steel, "by shooting an unarmed boy on a sacred quest." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Davis's face flushed with anger, but something else flickered in his eyes, a moment of unease, quickly suppressed. "That's a serious charge, Chief," he said. "Did you have proof?" "Only my son's word," Tokala replied. He saw a blue uniform before the shot was fired. Sarah turned to look at him, startled by this new information. Nakohe had seen his attacker. Why hadn't they told her? Davis dismissed the accusation with a wave of his hand. The boy was confused. Probably shot by his own people in a dispute. My people do not shoot children, Tokala said, his control slipping just enough for rage to color his tone. Unlike yours. Lieutenant Davis's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. Behind him, the settlers tensed, rifles shifting in their grips. Around the camp, Apache warriors notched arrows and raised spears, ready to defend their people. Sarah stepped forward, deliberately placing herself between the two groups. Enough! This is my land, and I will not have bloodshed on it. She fixed Lieutenant Davis with a steady gaze. You claim to represent the United States government. Does that government condone attacking peaceful people who have sought refuge with an American citizen? Davis hesitated, clearly unprepared for such direct challenge from a woman. Ma'am, you don't understand the situation. I understand it perfectly, Sarah interrupted. And I'll tell you this, if you force these people to leave before the boy is well enough to travel, and he dies as a result, I will hold you personally responsible. I will write to every newspaper from here to Washington, D.C. See that, and I will make certain that Colonel Harrington knows exactly what happened here today. The threat, delivered in her calm, clear voice, landed with visible impact. Davis glanced at the settlers, perhaps hoping for support, but even they looked uncertain now. 2 days, Sarah continued, pressing her advantage. That's all I'm asking. 2 days to ensure a child doesn't die unnecessarily. A tense silence followed, broken only by the snorting of horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah held her ground, heart pounding but face composed, aware of Tokala standing like a silent bulwark behind her. Then, unexpectedly, Nakohe appeared in the doorway of the cabin. He had dressed himself in his buckskin shirt, now mended by one of the Apache women, and stood as straight as his injury would allow. I am ready, he called out, his young voice carrying across the tense gathering. No need to fight. I can ride. Sarah turned in alarm. Nakohe, no! But the boy was already making his way down the porch steps, each movement clearly causing him pain, though he struggled not to show it. Makia appeared behind him, concern etched on his ancient face. See, Nakohe said, addressing Lieutenant Davis directly as he reached the bottom step. I am strong enough. His knees buckled then, the exertion too much for his weakened body. Tokala moved with lightning speed, catching his son before he could fall. The boy's face had gone ashen, and a dark stain was spreading across his bandaged side. The wound had reopened. Nakohe! Sarah rushed to his side, already lifting his shirt to assess the damage. As she exposed the bandage, now soaked with fresh blood, a collective intake of breath came from the settlers. Even Lieutenant Davis looked taken aback by the reality of the boy's wound. Get him inside, Sarah ordered, her nurse's training taking over. Quickly. As Tokala lifted his son, Nakohe's head lolled against his father's chest, consciousness slipping away. But before his eyes closed, the boy's gaze fixed on Lieutenant Davis with unmistakable recognition. It was him, Nakohe whispered, his voice faint but clear in the sudden silence. He shot me. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap, freezing every man present. Lieutenant Davis's face drained of color, then flushed crimson as all eyes turned to him. The boy's delirious, he snapped, but his hand had instinctively moved to his sidearm. Fever talking. Tokala, cradling his unconscious son, fixed Davis with a look of such cold fury that the young officer took an involuntary step back. My son does not lie, the chief said, his voice dangerously quiet. Even in delirium, Emmett Walsh dismounted slowly, his weathered face troubled as he looked from the bleeding boy to the lieutenant. "Davis, is there truth to this?" "Don't be absurd," the officer blustered. "Are you going to take the word of a savage child over an officer of the United States Army?" "I'm wondering," James Mason said, still atop his horse but no longer gripping his rifle, "why a boy would recognize you specifically if you'd never encountered him before." A murmur of agreement ran through the settlers. The Peterson brothers exchanged glances, their earlier hostility now tempered with uncertainty. Old Man Crawford spat into the dust, his rheumy eyes narrowed with suspicion. "We need to get him inside," Sarah interrupted, urgency in her voice as Nakohe's blood continued to soak through his bandages. "This can wait. The boy can't." Without waiting for permission, she led Tokala back toward the cabin, Makia following close behind. As they crossed the threshold, Sarah heard the rising voices of argument behind them, the settlers demanding answers, Davis attempting to reassert control. Inside, they laid Nakohe gently on the cot. The boy's face was pale as chalk, his breathing shallow. Sarah worked quickly, cutting away the soaked bandages to reveal the reopened wound. The sight made her heart sink. The healing flesh had torn, and fresh blood welled from the jagged opening. Hold him still," she instructed Tokala, reaching for clean cloths to staunch the bleeding. "Makia, I need your strongest medicine." The old healer was already grinding herbs in his mortar, his movements swift despite his age. Tokala held his son's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort in Apache as Sarah cleaned the wound. "He recognized the shooter," Sarah said quietly, her hands never pausing in their work. That's why you were so certain it was a soldier." Tokala nodded grimly. "He told me when he first woke, but a boy's word against a white officer—" He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. "Not just a boy's word anymore?" Sarah replied, pressing a poultice of Makia's herbs firmly against the wound. "There are witnesses now, men who heard him." Outside, the argument had escalated. Through the open door, Sarah caught fragments. Davis's increasingly defensive tone, Emmett's gruff insistence, Mason's quiet but firm questioning. The balance was shifting, uncertainty replacing the earlier certainty. A shadow fell across the threshold. Old Man Crawford stood there, his lined face solemn beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "How's the boy?" he asked, his voice gruffer than usual. "Fighting," Sarah answered honestly. "The wounds reopened." "He's lost blood," Crawford nodded, his gaze moving to Tokala, who remained at his son's side. "Lieutenant's story don't add up," he said. "Too nervous, keeps changing details." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, but determined. "Wanted you to know, we ain't all of one mind out there now. Some of us are thinking maybe this deadline ain't so important after all." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford." The old man nodded once, cast a final glance at Nakohe, then retreated, leaving them to their work. For the next hour, Sarah and Makia fought to stabilize the boy. They applied fresh poultices, bandaged the wound tightly, and managed to get a tea of willow bark and healing herbs past his lips. Gradually, Nakohe's breathing steadied, and some color returned to his face. When Sarah finally stepped outside, wiping blood from her hands with a damp cloth, she found the scene transformed. Lieutenant Davis was gone, as were most of the soldiers who had accompanied him. Only Emmett, Mason, and Crawford remained, seated on her porch steps like sentinels. "Where's the lieutenant?" she asked, the afternoon sun making her squint as she looked at them. "Had gone to answer some questions at Fort Grant," Emmett replied, standing to offer her his canteen. "Colonel Harrington's been sent for." Sarah accepted the water gratefully, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. You believe Nakohe, then? Let's say we've got enough doubts to want some answers, Mason said carefully. Davis couldn't explain why the boy would recognize him. Got all flustered when Crawford here mentioned that Davis was part of a patrol near this area the day the boy was shot. Said he was following orders, Crawford added, his voice heavy with disgust. Wouldn't say whose. Sarah sank down onto the step beside them, the implications washing over her. Someone wanted to sabotage the peace talks. Seems likely, Emmett agreed. There's those who profit from this conflict. Gun runners, land speculators, men who get government contracts to supply the forts. And those who simply hate, Mason added quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of human prejudice and greed hanging in the air between them. How's the boy? Crawford finally asked. Stable, for now, Sarah replied, but he won't be traveling anywhere soon. Not for at least a week, maybe more. The men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Tell Tokala he has his week, Emmett said finally. We'll keep the army off his back, least until Colonel Harrington sorts this mess out. Relief flooded through Sarah. Thank you, Mason stood, dusting off his trousers. Don't thank us yet. There'll be those who won't take kindly to this arrangement. We can't speak for everyone, but we can speak to everyone, Crawford put in, a hint of steel beneath his aged voice. Make sure they understand what's at stake here. As the men mounted their horses to leave, Emmett lingered behind. You've done a brave thing, Sarah, he said quietly. Risky, but brave. Your Thomas would have been proud. The mention of her late husband brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. I hope so, she whispered. Emmett nodded once, then rode away, leaving Sarah alone with the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. Inside the cabin, she found Nakohe sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and regular. Makia dozed in the corner, exhausted by the day's events. But Tokala was awake, standing at the window, his profile etched against the golden light. Your neighbors have gone? He asked without turning. Yes, Sarah replied, moving to stand beside him. They've agreed to give Nakohe time to heal, a week, at least. Tokala turned to face her then, surprise evident in his dark eyes. They believed him. They have doubts about Davis, at least, Sarah said, enough to want answers. A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Tokala spoke, his voice low and intense. You stood between my son and harm today. Between my people and those who would do them violence. Why? Sarah considered the question, wanting to give him the truth he deserved. Because it was right, she said simply. Because a child's life matters more than old hatreds. Because I've seen too much death already. She paused, then added softly, and because I've come to care for him, for all of you. Tokala studied her face in the fading light, searching for something. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, for he reached out slowly, deliberately, and took her hand in his. My people have a saying, he said, his fingers warm against hers. The greatest strength is not in the arm that wields the weapon, but in the heart that chooses peace when war would be easier. His thumb traced a gentle circle on her palm. You have such strength, Sarah Wilkins. The intimacy of the gesture, the warmth in his voice, sent a tremor through Sarah that had nothing to do with fear. For 3 years, she had lived in isolation, her heart closed off after Thomas's death. Now, unexpectedly, impossibly, she felt it opening again. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, my son heals, Tokala replied. And we wait to see if truth can overcome hatred. His hand still held hers, neither of them willing to break the connection. And after, a smile touched Tokala's lips, transforming his stern features. After is a new path, one I had not foreseen. In that moment, with the last rays of sunset gilding the room and Nakohe's steady breathing the only sound, Sarah felt a certainty she had not known since before Thomas fell ill. The future was unwritten, fraught with challenges she could scarcely imagine, but it no longer stretched before her empty and alone. 1 year later, the homestead had changed, just as its inhabitants had changed. New buildings stood alongside the original cabin, a larger house built in the white man's style, but incorporating elements of Apache design, a barn twice the size of the old one, and at the edge of the property, several traditional Apache lodges. Sarah stood on the porch of the new house, watching as riders approached from the east, Emmett Walsh and Colonel Harrington from Fort Grant, right on time for the monthly council meeting. In the yard, Nakohe practiced with a bow, his movements fluid and confident, no sign remaining of the wound that had nearly taken his life. At 14, he was growing tall, his frame filling out with the promise of the man he would become. "They're here!" Sarah called over her shoulder into the house. Tokala emerged, dressed in a curious blend of Apache and white man's clothing, buckskin pants and vest over a cotton shirt, his long hair still worn in the traditional style with a single eagle feather. He stood beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of long familiarity. "Ready?" he asked, the simple word encompassing all the complexity of what they had built together. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the silver band on her finger, a marriage recognized by both their peoples, though not yet by the territory's law. That would come in time, they believed. All things changed, eventually. In the wake of Lieutenant Davis's court-martial and the revelation of a conspiracy involving several officers and local businessmen to sabotage the peace talks, Colonel Harrington had become an unexpected ally. The monthly councils, bringing together settlers, military representatives, and Apache leaders, had been his idea, a forum for addressing grievances before they festered into violence. It wasn't perfect. There were still raids, still retaliations, still deep-seated prejudices on both sides. But here, on this patch of Arizona soil, something new had taken root. An understanding that began with a woman's compassion for a wounded child. As the riders dismounted, Nakohe paused in his practice to greet them. Emmett, who had become something of an uncle figure to the boy, ruffled his hair affectionately. Colonel Harrington shook his hand with formal respect. "He grows stronger every time I see him," the colonel observed as he approached the porch, a credit to both his peoples. Tokala inclined his head in acknowledgement of the compliment. "He walks two paths," he said. "As we all must learn to do." Sarah squeezed her husband's hand, gratitude washing through her as she surveyed the life they had built from the ashes of conflict. Their home had become a symbol, a place where enemies could meet as friends, where old wounds might begin to heal. "A year ago," she said softly, "I found a dying boy beneath a juniper tree and changed the course of many lives," Tokala finished, his eyes holding hers with a warmth that still took her breath away. As they welcomed their guests inside, Sarah thought of the long journey that had brought them to this moment, from a stormy night and a desperate act of compassion to a new kind of family, a new vision of what might be possible. The path ahead remained uncertain. The Arizona Territory was still a harsh land, divided by history and hatred. But here, in this place, a different story was being written, one small choice at a time. And for now, that was enough.